It wasn't a falling out. As I did Grand Prix, Steve was originally slated to do that movie, but he couldn't get along with Frankenheimer. And so that lasted about 30 minutes, and Steve was out and I was in.
For decades, fans believed the bond between James Garner and Steve McQueen was built on mutual respect. They were Hollywood royalty, two leading men who lit up the screen and defined an era. But behind the charm, the glitz, and the blockbuster success was a story no one dared to tell. James Garner had stayed quiet. For years, he let the rumors swirl about jealousy, about betrayal, about the tension on set that almost tore The Great Escape apart. He didn't play the Hollywood gossip game. He never aired his dirty laundry. Until now. Because when James Garner finally spoke, it wasn't in a tabloid interview or a passing remark. It was in his own words, clear, direct, and utterly devastating. He called McQueen a pain in the ass, said the so-called king of cool was anything but, described him as insecure, paranoid, and obsessed with control. And when Garner pulled back the curtain, what he revealed wasn't just a feud between two actors. It was a brutal look at the price of fame, ego, and what happens when the spotlight gets too bright for one man to handle. This isn't the story Hollywood wanted you to hear. It's the truth James Garner took years to finally admit. And once you hear it, you'll never look at Steve McQueen the same way again. A childhood that could have broken him. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, James Garner learned how to fight first, to survive. His story didn't begin in Hollywood. It began in the dirt roads of Norman, Oklahoma, where life was anything but glamorous. His mother passed away when he was just 4 years old, leaving a wound that never truly healed. And when his father remarried, young James didn't find comfort in a new maternal figure. Instead, he found Wilma, a woman so cruel, so vindictive, that her actions bordered on psychological torture. She beat him with tree branches. She forced him into dresses to humiliate him. She didn't just punish, she broke spirits. But James wouldn't stay broken. At just 14, something inside him snapped. One violent night, after enduring too much for too long, he fought back. He didn't care about the consequences, he was done being a victim. And as he stood up to the woman who tried to shatter him, his father finally intervened, breaking up the fight. Garner later admitted, if his father hadn't stepped in, things might have gone too far. He might have crossed a line he couldn't come back from. But the damage was already done. His stepmother would soon be gone, but so would his father. Weldon Garner abandoned the family, vanishing without warning and leaving James and his brothers to fend for themselves. No money, no parents, just survival. While other teens were worrying about dances or dates, James was figuring out how to stay alive. And yet, through it all, he didn't fold, he adapted. That same fight, that same quiet strength, would become the backbone of every role he played. The reluctant star who took over Hollywood. Hollywood wasn't calling his name. In fact, James Garner wasn't even looking for fame. After surviving a fractured childhood and the trauma of abandonment, Garner bounced through life with no clear direction. He tried working in the merchant navy, but chronic seasickness ended that fast. He pumped gas, laid carpets with his father, and even ironically posed as an underwear model just to make ends meet. It was a far cry from movie sets and red carpets. Then fate intervened. A chance encounter with Paul Gregory, a man with an eye for talent, changed everything. At first, Garner brushed off Gregory's suggestion to try acting. The idea of pretending to be someone else seemed absurd to a guy who'd spent his whole life trying to just be real. But years later, something clicked. He saw Gregory's name on a talent agency sign, and on a whim, walked in. That split-second decision would rewrite his destiny. He got his first role in the Caine Mutiny court-martial. No lines, just a guy in the background. But what he lacked in dialogue, he made up for in presence. Casting agents noticed something in him, a rugged authenticity that couldn't be faked. Soon, he landed a part alongside Marlon Brando in Sayonara. But it wasn't until 1957 that the world truly saw what James Garner was capable of. Brett Maverick, cool under pressure, smart, charming. a gambler with a heart and a punchline. Garner didn't just play Maverick. He was Maverick. The wit, the dry humor, the quiet toughness, it was all real. Audiences fell in love. Week after week, Maverick pulled viewers away from juggernauts like The Ed Sullivan Show. Nobody expected it to succeed, but Garner's magnetism made the show a phenomenon. Overnight, he became a household name. But what Hollywood didn't expect, what they were totally unprepared for, was that this new star wasn't going to play by their rules. Because while Garner was lighting up the screen, behind the scenes, a storm was brewing. And when a writer's strike hit in 1960, James Garner would do the unthinkable. He took on the studio. And he won. The role that made him, and the rivalry that followed. By the time James Garner walked away from Maverick, he wasn't just a TV star, he was a statement. A symbol of someone who refused to be chewed up and molded by the Hollywood machine. He had taken on one of the biggest studios in the business, and won. But he didn't celebrate. He moved in silence, waiting for the next chapter, because he knew that being right wasn't the same as staying relevant. Then came a phone call that would change everything. In 1963, Garner was cast in The Great Escape, a high-octane World War II epic based on a real-life Allied prison break. The film wasn't just another war movie. It was a massive, ambitious ensemble drama, directed by John Sturges, packed with the best actors of the day. And it was the big screen breakthrough Garner had been waiting for. He would star as Lieutenant Bob Hendley, a smooth-talking American pilot nicknamed the Scrounger, a man whose charm could unlock doors, steal documents, and grease every gear of the prison break operation. It was a perfect fit. Garner didn't need to act like Hendley. He was Hendley. Resourceful, quick-thinking, effortlessly likable. But he wasn't the only rising star in the cast. Sharing the screen with him was a man with a chip on his shoulder, a growing fan base, and a burning need to be number one: Steve McQueen. McQueen had been gaining traction in Hollywood, but The Great Escape was his chance to go global. He played Captain Virgil Hiltz, the Cooler King, a rebellious loner who spends much of the film locked in solitary confinement, bouncing a baseball off a wall in total defiance. The motorcycle, the leather jacket, the stare. It all screamed cool. But behind that calculated image, something was simmering. While audiences would eventually cheer the film's thrilling tone and iconic performances, the production itself was tense. This was no smooth, brotherly collaboration. It was a battlefield with egos, not bullets. Garner, a trained veteran with real scars from the Korean War, brought calm to the set. He took direction, delivered scenes, and kept the focus on the story. McQueen brought intensity and demands and heat. From the early days of shooting in Germany, the contrast was clear. Garner was approachable, relaxed, and professional. McQueen was restless, arriving in his Rolls-Royce, staying in a private chalet, and keeping his co-stars at a calculated distance. Tensions began to mount as McQueen, who was promised a big spotlight, realized that the ensemble nature of the film meant sharing that spotlight. And Garner's natural screen presence wasn't helping. In scene after scene, Garner's effortless charm threatened to outshine McQueen's forced cool. He wasn't trying to steal attention. He just had something McQueen couldn't fake: ease. According to insiders, McQueen began counting lines, watching the dailies closely, and complaining to the director about the balance of the script. He felt his role lacked heroism. He wanted more danger, more action, more him. So the film was rewritten to include one of the most iconic moments in cinema history: the motorcycle escape. A last-minute addition, choreographed almost entirely to satisfy McQueen's ego. And it worked on camera. McQueen soared over fences into legend. But off-camera, the damage had been done. Director John Sturges, exhausted by McQueen's antics, reportedly approached Garner with a radical idea. What if we shift the film's focus? What if you become the central hero? Garner declined. He knew that move would blow up the production, and he wasn't interested in drama. He was there to work, not win a popularity contest. Still, the rift between him and McQueen had become undeniable, They barely spoke outside of scenes. There was no camaraderie, no real connection. Just two very different men, one grounded in truth, the other obsessed with image, fighting an invisible war behind every glance. When The Great Escape finally hit theaters, audiences were captivated. They cheered for the ensemble. They rooted for the heroes. And they fell in love with the legend. But only one of those legends was real. Because behind the scenes, Steve McQueen may have gotten the spotlight. But James Garner kept the respect, and decades later, when Garner finally told his side of the story, the truth was even sharper than anyone expected. The rivalry that Hollywood tried to hide. For years, Hollywood packaged their relationship as cordial. Two tough guys who worked hard, shared the screen, and delivered gold. But that was the lie. And James Garner, he waited a long time before telling the truth. In the Garner Files, his 2011 memoir, the floodgates opened. And when they did, Steve McQueen's carefully built persona started to crack. Because behind the effortless cool and leather jacket swagger, Garner saw something else entirely. Insecure. Jealous. A pain in the ass. That's how Garner described him. And he wasn't being dramatic, he was being exact. Because McQueen didn't just rub him the wrong way. He disrupted everything. On set, McQueen was volatile. One moment he'd be withdrawn, silent, moody, unreachable. The next he was explosive, demanding rewrites, arguing over screen time, slamming props between takes. And what triggered it all? Comparison. McQueen couldn't stand not being the biggest star in the room. He watched Garner, who wasn't trying to impress anyone, who didn't chase approval, and he seethed. Garner's laid-back presence threatened everything McQueen built his image on. While Garner joked with the crew and kept things light, McQueen analyzed every moment, trying to calculate who was getting more attention, more laughs, more camera love. He was obsessed with fairness, but only when it came to himself. Garner would later reveal that McQueen went so far as to count lines in the script, tallying who spoke more and for how long. When he felt outmatched, he lobbied the director. Not for the story, but for status. And if that wasn't enough, McQueen's paranoia didn't stop at work. It bled into his marriage. He became convinced completely without evidence that Garner was having an affair with his wife Neil. It wasn't true. There was no flirting, no tension, no secrets. Just McQueen's spiraling insecurities, turning shadows into monsters. The accusation stunned Garner. Neil herself, emotionally drained, confided in him. She told Garner about the fights, the outbursts, the crushing weight of Steve's jealousy. And still, Garner didn't strike back. He didn't spread rumors. He didn't fire insults. He waited for decades. Until he was old enough and wise enough to say it plainly. Steve wasn't a bad guy, but he was deeply insecure. That single sentence explained everything. The tantrums, the competitive edge, the need to dominate every frame. Steve McQueen wasn't a villain. He was scared. Scared of being forgotten. Scared of being second best. Scared of being vulnerable in a world that only rewarded dominance. But Garner saw through all of it. And what hurt him most wasn't the rivalry. It was the waste. Because behind McQueen's ego was a man with real potential. Potential that was constantly buried beneath fear and image control. To Garner, McQueen could have been great. Not just famous, but respected. If only he had let his guard down. Even the director of The Great Escape, John Sturges, got fed up. He reportedly considered cutting McQueen's part and restructuring the film entirely around Garner. But Garner declined the offer. He wasn't looking to steal scenes, he was trying to survive them. The quiet war between the two men never erupted into headlines. But it shaped every moment they shared on screen. Their chemistry was real because their tension was real. And that's what audiences felt, even if they couldn't name it. Years later, as the world continued to worship McQueen's image, the bikes, the sunglasses, the stoic rebellion, Garner offered a sobering contrast. He stripped away the myth. He showed the man beneath it. And he didn't do it to win. He did it because someone had to tell the truth. Because in a town full of legends built on lies, James Garner remained the rare man who never needed one. Brutal honesty, and no one was safe. Steve McQueen wasn't the only target of James Garner's brutal honesty. Once he opened up in the Garner Files, it became clear he had spent a lifetime biting his tongue, watching Hollywood play nice on camera and dirty behind the scenes. And when he finally spoke up, he didn't come out swinging. He came out surgical. He didn't need exaggeration. He didn't need drama. He just needed the truth. And no one was safe. One of the first names he called out was Jack Warner, the legendary head of Warner Bros. To the world, Warner was a titan of the studio system. To Garner, he was one of the rudest men I've ever met. And that wasn't a punchline. It was a verdict. Garner remembered meetings where Warner wouldn't even look him in the eye. He described conversations where Warner spoke about him like he wasn't in the room. The man who helped build Hollywood's golden age treated his actors like tools, replaceable, breakable, disposable, and Garner never forgot it. Because he had fought that machine. And he wore the scars. Then came Charlton Heston, Hollywood royalty. Star of Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and more iconic roles than most actors could dream of. But to Garner, Heston was stiff, literally. Wooden, he called him. Unable to let emotion touch the surface. It wasn't petty. It was just accurate. But if Garner's words about Warner and Heston stung, his memories of Charles Bronson burned. Because unlike the others, this one was personal. It started innocently enough. A friendly poker game at Garner's house, full of regulars, actors, extras, guys trying to catch a break. Garner loved the game, not for the money, but for the camaraderie. Then Bronson showed up. Gruff, quiet, tense in a way that made people lean back. But that night, the pot wasn't big. Just enough to make it interesting. One hand in, a struggling extra, a guy barely scraping by, won a decent amount. Not life-changing, just enough to matter. And Bronson refused to pay. He brushed it off, dismissed the guy, tried to walk away like it didn't count. Garner wasn't having it. He stood up literally, told Bronson to pay up, to honor the table, to show some decency. It nearly turned violent. There were shouts, threats. Two men who had seen combat, now ready to throw fists in a Hollywood living room over something as simple as respect. Bronson backed down. But the damage was done. The air changed. And from that night on, they never spoke the same way again. Years later, they ran into each other in a restaurant. Same cold eyes, same tension. Still no apology. Still no handshake. Garner later said the grudge never left either of them. Because some things, some kinds of disrespect, just sit in your bones. And that was the thing about Garner. He didn't explode. He didn't gossip. He remembered. He had no patience for bullies, no love for egos, and zero tolerance for fakery. But here's what made him different from so many others who tell it like it is. Garner didn't dish it out unless he was willing to dish it on himself too. He talked openly about using drugs in Hollywood, not for headlines, but because it was the truth. He admitted to doing lines of white powder with comedian John Belushi, long before Belushi's tragic end. He reflected on how Hollywood blurred the lines between indulgence and escape, and how easy it was to fall into both. But unlike others, Garner didn't glorify it. He didn't brag. He simply said, "Yeah, I was there too, and it wasn't pretty." He even joked about his brief stint with MJ, saying it made him laugh so hard he couldn't walk. But there was always a shadow behind the laughter, like he knew the industry's dirty habits were costing people more than anyone wanted to admit. He also didn't shy away from talking politics, another taboo for most actors. Garner was a proud liberal. He admired Adlai Stevenson, Barack Obama, and wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even when it cost him roles. In a town where most people stayed silent to protect their brand, Garner took sides. Loudly. And often. And when asked about his career, he didn't pretend every film was a masterpiece. He openly admitted that a lot of his movies were bad, mediocre, forgettable. He even joked that half his filmography could be used as Ambien. But when he talked about the Americanization of Emily or Murphy's Romance, his tone changed. Those were the ones that mattered. The ones he was proud of. The ones where he could be real. And maybe that's why his words hit so hard, because you knew they were coming from a man who never pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was. In a business of backpats and fake smiles, Garner spoke plainly. And in doing so, he gave us something more powerful than gossip: perspective. The Rockford Files, peak pain and the price of doing it his way. By the early 1970s, most actors would have coasted. James Garner could have leaned on his fame, collected easy paychecks, and faded into the background like so many of his peers. But that wasn't him. He wasn't here to survive the system. He wanted to reshape it. And that's exactly what he did with the Rockford Files. In 1974, Garner teamed up with Roy Huggins, the same man who helped launch Maverick, and a rising writer named Stephen J. Cannell, who had a wild idea. What if a private investigator was nothing like the hard-nosed, gun-toting, cigar-chomping tough guys dominating TV at the time?
What if he lived in a trailer?
Wore beat-up sport coats? Chased bad guys reluctantly, and often got beat up for his trouble? And just like that, Jim Rockford was born. A character who felt real, not slick, not polished but smart, scrappy and constantly in over his head. He didn't shoot his way out of trouble. He talked, he negotiated, he hustled. And when all else failed, he ran. Garner brought the role to life with ease because he wasn't acting. Jim Rockford was him. A good man trying to stay afloat in a crooked world. Too honest to cheat, too smart to quit. It was a mirror, and audiences instantly saw themselves in it. The Rockford Files wasn't just a hit. It was a revolution. It shattered the mold of what a TV detective could be. Critics praised its humor, its heart, and its grounded tone. Each episode opened with a fake answering machine message, funny, quirky, and uniquely personal. Eventually, writers across NBC were submitting suggestions just to get a chance at that one line. Even the theme song, composed by Mike Post, became a radio hit. But beneath the witty writing and sly banter, Garner was breaking down. He insisted on doing most of his own stunts, just like he had on Maverick. But now, he was in his mid-40s, pushing his body through high-speed car chases, staircase falls, and barroom brawls week after week. Each stunt left its mark. Torn ligaments, cracked ribs, agonizing back pain. By season 4, he was icing his knees between scenes and popping painkillers just to stand up straight. Yet he kept going. Why? Because the Rockford Files wasn't just a show. It was his statement. A chance to control the narrative. To show Hollywood he could be the star his way without capes, without cap guns, without compromise. But the price was mounting. Behind the scenes, Universal Studios, the same people reaping the rewards, began cutting corners. Episodes were shot faster. Budgets were squeezed. Garner started noticing unpaid residuals. Money missing. Numbers that didn't add up. And just like he did with Warner Brothers, he said, enough. He sued Universal for breach of contract and unpaid royalties. The case dragged on for 8 long years. But he didn't flinch. Even with the stress, the pain, and the growing fatigue, he stood firm. And once again, he won. The details were sealed. The payout was private. But the message? Loud and clear. You don't screw James Garner. Eventually, the physical toll became too much. Doctors warned him to stop. His back was wrecked, his knees barely functioned. And in 1980, The Rockford Files aired its final episode, but the show refused to die. In the 19, Garner returned for 8 TV movies, bringing Rockford back older, wiser, slower, but still just as sharp. Fans loved it. Because even as time passed, Rockford still felt real. And real never goes out of style. Ironically, the series that made him iconic nearly destroyed him. The injuries lingered. The lawsuit scarred him. And still, he never once regretted it. Because The Rockford Files wasn't just his greatest role, It was his revenge against every executive who doubted him, every critic who dismissed him, and every actor who thought charm couldn't carry a show. Jim Rockford was the underdog. So was James Garner. And that's why the character and the man behind him still matter. Later life. Decline and one final act of grit. For most of his career, James Garner walked with the quiet confidence of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. He didn't chase awards. He didn't trade favors. He let the work speak. And for decades, it roared. But no matter how tough you are, time eventually lowers the volume. By the late 1980s, the signs of wear were impossible to ignore. His back ruined by years of stunts. His knees bone grinding against bone. Neck pain, shoulder tears. Nerve damage from high-impact falls. It all came rushing back, like overdue bills from a past he refused to regret. In 1988, the first major alarm rang. Heart surgery. Not minor, not optional. The real kind, where silence fills the waiting room and every breath after feels borrowed. Garner survived it. Brushed it off. Cracked a joke. Went back to work. But behind the humor, the fight was getting harder. Still, in 2000, he took one more swing at the big screen. Space Cowboys, a film about aging astronauts called back for one last mission. Garner starred alongside Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones, and Donald Sutherland, a dream cast for fans of old-school cinema. But filming wasn't easy. During production, Garner dislocated his shoulder. The pain was brutal. He was 72, and yet when asked how it happened, he shrugged, "I was just being clumsy." No drama, no special treatment, just grit. And in one of the film's most unforgettable scenes, the four aging leads bared it all, literally mooning the camera in a moment of comic vulnerability. Garner went along with it. No hesitation, because in his mind, age wasn't something to fear, it was something to face and laugh at, but his body was keeping score. By the mid-2000s, Garner's public appearances grew rare. He was slowing down. TV cameos stopped. Interviews became shorter. Even his voice, once deep and effortless, began to waver. Then in 2008, the blow he couldn't bounce back from. A massive stroke. He collapsed. Hospitalized. For the first time in his life, James Garner couldn't stand tall. Couldn't flash that grin. Couldn't walk into a room and carry the weight like he always had. The man who once ran across sets, leapt into moving cars, and fought studios to a standstill was now struggling to hold a fork. It was a cruel reversal. And yet, not once did he complain publicly. Not once did he ask for pity. He lived his final years in near silence, shielded by family and a few close friends. His wife Lois Clark stood by him as she always had. Their marriage, unusual by Hollywood standards, had lasted almost 58 years. They defied every odd, every gossip column, every scandal cycle. Because where others looked for image, they built something real. And when James Garner finally passed on July 19, 2014, the news hit like a punch to the chest. Not because he was young. He was 86. Not because it was sudden. He had been declining. But because the silence felt permanent now. He died of a heart attack, peacefully, quietly, the same way he lived. With no spectacle, no curtain call, just gone. But what remained was enormous. Tributes poured in from around the world. Fans, fellow actors, writers, directors, even people who'd only seen a few episodes of the Rockford Files or caught The Great Escape on cable one Sunday afternoon. They felt it. They felt like someone solid had left the world. Someone who didn't lie to them. Someone who never acted like he was better than the audience. And they were right. Because James Garner wasn't a Hollywood machine. He was a man. A tough, scarred, funny, wounded, principled man who walked through fire and came out quieter, but never smaller. Conclusion and legacy. What Garner's final words really meant. When James Garner finally broke his silence on Steve McQueen, it wasn't revenge. It wasn't ego. And it sure as hell wasn't jealousy. It was truth. The kind of truth most people in Hollywood spend their entire lives hiding from. He didn't tear McQueen down to get applause. He didn't expose him for ratings or clicks. He simply told the story as it really happened. And in doing so, he did something that very few stars ever dare to do. He reminded us that not every legend is built on greatness. Some are built on insecurity, on charm without substance, on fear masquerading as rebellion. Garner never denied McQueen's talent. He never dismissed his magnetism or his impact. But he pulled back the curtain and showed the man behind the motorcycle, behind the swagger, behind the myth. And what we saw was fragile. A star who couldn't handle being second. A man who couldn't see admiration without suspicion. A friend who saw threats where there were none. Garner, by contrast, never needed the stunts. He didn't have to scream to be heard or pick fights to stay relevant. He had nothing to prove, because he knew exactly who he was. And maybe that's what made McQueen so uneasy. Because deep down, even McQueen knew he was chasing what Garner already had. But Garner's legacy isn't defined by rivalry. It's defined by integrity. He walked away from studios when they tried to cheat him. He stood up to bullies. He did his own stunts, took his own hits, and lived his life without wearing a mask. And in the end, it wasn't the flashiest actor, or the loudest ego, or the biggest paycheck that left the deepest mark. It was the man who told the truth. Even when it cost him. Even when it hurt. Even when no one else dared. That's James Garner's real legacy. Not just as a star, but as Hollywood's last straight shooter. And now that we've heard what he really thought of Steve McQueen, we're left with one simple question. How many other Hollywood legends are we still seeing through a mask? If you found this side of James Garner as shocking as we did, the battles he fought, the truths he revealed, and the legacy he left behind, go ahead and hit that like button to show some love for one of Hollywood's most honest legends. And if you want more untold stories like this, from behind the scenes, beyond the headlines, and straight from the stars who lived it, like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss what Hollywood tried to keep hidden. We want to hear from you too. What do you think of James Garner's truth about Steve McQueen? Was it justified? Was it overdue? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. Thanks for watching. And remember, not all legends wear masks. Some just tell the truth.